Boston, 1847. A city bursting at the seams as ship after ship unloaded desperate souls fleeing hunger, heartbreak, and ruin in one of history's darkest times, the Great Famine. The Irish came with hope and heartbreak in equal measure. What they brought with them wasn't just grief, it was memory. And through memory, they carried food. Cramped tenements became makeshift kitchens. Meals weren't just eaten, they were endured, cherished, and sometimes shared. Potatoes, cabbage, pork soaked in brine, fish scraps from the market, whatever filled bellies and wrapped immigrants in a sliver of comfort. But here's the twist. These survival dishes didn't just sustain the poor. They became part of Boston's permanent flavor. What was once hardship became heritage. Let's explore 25 foods that fed the Irish in 19th century Boston and still echo on New England plates today. 1. New England boiled dinner. One pot, one hope. That's what New England boiled dinner represented. Picture a small stove tucked into a South Boston tenement, steam rising as corned beef gently simmers, cabbage softens on top, and hearty root vegetables fill the spaces between. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot, heavy, and enough. Back in Ireland, beef had been luxury, rare and beyond reach. But in Boston, salted beef was affordable and sold in bulk. Add in the ever-present potatoes and cabbage, and a new staple was born, filling, frugal, and familiar. Boiling everything in one pot made fuel-efficient sense, and leftovers often became hash the next morning. The dish evolved, but its roots stayed deep. What began as immigrant thrift became local tradition. Today, corned beef and cabbage fill plates on St. Patrick's Day, not just for celebration, but as a tribute, a reminder of those who came with little and left lasting flavor. This dish? It's a symbol of survival disguised as a holiday meal. 2. Irish stew. If New England boiled dinner was born in Boston, Irish stew made the journey across the Atlantic. No meal was more deeply tied to memory. Imagine mutton or cheap cuts, simmering slowly with potatoes, onions, and carrots, melding into something warm, humble, and unmistakably Irish. In Ireland, lamb and mutton were common, even necessary. But Boston's markets rarely offered them affordably. So the recipe changed, using beef scraps, whatever could be bought or bartered, softened over long hours in a pot. Potatoes and onions filled the gaps. Over time, the stew became more about warmth than meat, and more about holding on than letting go. Irish stew wasn't just nourishment. It was history by the spoonful. It was the dish that said, "We're still here." Even now, a steaming bowl of stew in Boston isn't just a meal, it's resistance, identity, and a soft echo of home. 3. Bacon and cabbage with boiled potatoes. Sunday dinner in Irish Boston had a familiar smell. Salty pork, soft cabbage, steaming potatoes. It was simple, but in its simplicity, a kind of quiet pride. This wasn't the crispy bacon most know today. It was usually salt-cured pork, cheap, fatty, and boiled until it softened enough to slice. The cabbage was tender, the potatoes earthy, and what it lacked in elegance it made up for with comfort. In Ireland, this trio had long filled farmhouse tables. In Boston, it brought Irish families dignity in the midst of dirt floors and cold rooms. One pot did the job. The leftover broth might stretch into soup. Nothing wasted, everything accounted for. Over time, bacon and cabbage stepped beyond hardship and became heritage. It reminded families where they came from and how far they'd come. In its plainness was power, and in every bite, a story of survival laced with home. 4. Salted pork with cabbage and turnips. When wallets were thin, which was almost always, salted pork and cabbage helped Irish families stretch the week. Sold from barrels along the docks, the pork was cheap, packed with salt, and often more fat than meat. But it was food, and food meant life. They'd soak it overnight to leach out the salt, then boil it slow with cabbage and turnips until the fat melted into flavor. What began tough ended tender. What started poor became hearty. Cabbage filled the pot, turnips added weight, and the pork, meager as it was, brought it all together. In famine memory households, this stew was sacred. It meant no one went to bed hungry. Its smell lingered in narrow hallways, and to those who lived it, that aroma wasn't poverty, it was comfort. A signal that, at least tonight, there was something warm to eat. The magic wasn't in the ingredients, but in what they meant. 5. Barley soup with onions, carrots, and potatoes, cold Boston nights pressed into every crack. And when meat ran scarce, barley soup was the warmth families clung to. Barley wasn't just filling, it was forgiving. Tossed into boiling water with chopped onions, carrots, and potatoes, it stretched small amounts into big meals. If meat surfaced in the pot, it was a small miracle. Most times, it was just root vegetables and grain. Back in Ireland, barley had long been the grain of the poor. Bread, beer, or soup, it kept hunger at bay. In Boston, it did the same. Mothers could ladle it out for 6 kids, with maybe enough left for neighbors. Even the broth felt like a gift. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't exciting, but it was enough. And sometimes, enough was everything. More than filling bellies, it reminded families they'd made it one more day. And in kitchens like these, survival was shared 1 spoon at a time. 6. Oatmeal porridge with water or milk. In every Irish tenement, from dawn till night, oatmeal porridge simmered. Morning, supper, or in between, it was the dish that never failed. Oats boiled in water, thick and grey, sometimes kissed with milk if fortune smiled. That was it. It didn't need more, because there wasn't more. Porridge had powered Irish farmers for generations. In Boston, it powered dock workers, seamstresses, and children too young to understand why their bellies always ached. Sugar? Rare. Butter? A luxury. What it lacked in sweetness, it made up for with substance. Wealthier neighbors scoffed. Poor man's gruel, they called it. But for the Irish, it was dignity in a bowl, a promise that their children wouldn't leave the house empty. It was survival, meal after meal. It filled the empty in both stomach and spirit, and every bubbling pot whispered the same message. Tomorrow would come, and they'd face it fed. 7. Irish soda bread with butter. Few smells could stop chaos in a Boston tenement like Irish soda bread baking thick on a hot slab of iron. Flour. Baking soda, buttermilk, a pinch of salt, that's all it took. No yeast, no waiting. Just quick, kneaded lifelines turned golden and warm. Back home, soda bread had been a cornerstone, quick to bake, loaded with carbs, and ready to fill empty corners during hard winters. The tradition crossed the Atlantic intact. In Boston, it became more than food. It was comfort, sliced thick, slathered with butter, if there was any, and passed from hand to hand till only crumbs were left. For hungry children, crumb by crumb meant they'd sleep full. For their mothers, it was proof they could still do something right. Today, Irish soda bread still graces shelves in March, but in its crust lies a history of endurance, fast hands, and meals stretched further than they should. Before we move on to the next traditional dish, if this deep dive into forgotten immigrant meals is stirring something in you, go ahead and give this video a like. It helps us bring you more stories like this. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to discover how food tells the real stories of where we come from. 8. Boiled salt cod with potatoes and onions. Salt cod, rigid, preserved, dependable, became a familiar sight in Irish homes along Boston's harbor front. It wasn't fresh, but it was cheap. Sold by the slab, chipped away, soaked for hours to tame the salt. Once softened, it was boiled alongside potatoes and onions into a humble, briny stew. It wasn't elegant, but it filled empty bellies when little else could. In Ireland, salted fish was common along the coastlines. In Boston, it became essential, shipped in endless supply from Newfoundland and the Grand Banks. Fridays, marked by Catholic practice, made seafood the mandatory meal. Salt cod played its role again and again. The scent filled stairwells. The pot never held much, but second helpings were offered, if only in spirit. Salt cod reminded families that even in a city far from home, the ocean still gave, as long as you knew how to stretch it. 9. Pan-fried potatoes and onions with fat or bacon bits. Sometimes dinner was yesterday's potatoes, sliced thin and tossed into a skillet with sizzling onions and leftover bacon grease. And somehow, it tasted like a feast. This was ingenuity on a plate, scraps reimagined into something rich and golden. Bacon was rare, but its drippings lingered. On lucky days, A few crisp bits made it into the pan. Irish mothers were masters at turning leftovers into lifelines. Pan-fried potatoes could stretch a meager bowl into something memorable. For kids, it was a treasured break from boiled roots and porridge. For adults, it was filling, fast, and just a little indulgent. Back in Ireland, the humble potato had kept families alive. In Boston, it remained sacred, but a crisp edge and smoky bite turned survival into subtle comfort. This wasn't just a meal. It was a quiet victory, proof that scraps could become something worth savoring. 10. Vegetable pottage with peas, turnips, and onions. No meat. No money, no options. That's when the pot filled with pottage. Whatever scraps could be found, peas, turnips, onions, a stray leaf of cabbage, went in. Boiled down, it became thick, earthy, and dependable. It may not have had richness, but it had purpose. In Ireland, vegetable pottage had long been the bedrock of poor kitchens. Peas added texture. Turnips brought bulk. Onions gave the pot life. In Boston, the recipe didn't change. It merely adapted. Broth was reused, bread was dipped, and water was added when more mouths arrived. It became a kind of glue, uniting neighbors, stretching luck and tasting better when shared. In a world of winter air and thin wages, this stew spoke volumes, that families could still sit together in hunger and hope, and find warmth in a shared bowl. There wasn't much, but there was enough. 11. Colcannon. Colcannon wasn't a special occasion dish, it was everyday magic. Creamy mashed potatoes swirled with wilted cabbage or kale, crowned with a melting knob of butter. In Ireland, it had been peasant food. In Boston, it was memory disguised as dinner. The ingredients were humble. Potatoes, always the foundation. Cabbage often in surplus. Butter, used sparingly unless it was payday. But the flavor? Pure comfort. Kids scraped bowls clean, chasing swirls of butter into every corner. The dish was soft, warm, and lovingly Irish. Each bite tasted like what once was, and what still could be. A grounded sense of identity planted in something as simple as mash. Even in tight quarters and colder months, Colcannon reminded families what mattered. Tradition didn't need wealth, it just needed roots. And this dish, served again and again, grew deeper ones with every spoonful. 12. Boiled ham and root vegetables. Every so often a meal felt like a celebration, and boiled ham offered that rare moment. A tough ham shank or hock simmered low and long, steeping parsnips, carrots, potatoes, and turnips in flavor. The meat wasn't fancy, but it meant something more than hunger. It meant things were temporarily better. Back in Ireland, pork had often been salted or smoked to last lean months. In Boston, the method stuck. Ham was cheaper than beef and could feed a table with enough vegetables around it. Sundays after church, families gathered around it. Not just for food, but for a sense of celebration. It was a brief pause between hard weeks, and even when meat was minimal, the rich broth infused the roots with warmth. This meal became a kind of ritual, less about indulgence, more about unity. A pot full of sustenance and memory stewed together. 13. Boiled oats, steel-cut oats, with milk or water. Day after day, a pot of slow-simmered oats carried Irish families through. The oats were coarse, steel-cut, and boiled into the kind of breakfast that didn't taste like much, but filled you for hours. When milk was available, it lightened the texture. When it wasn't, water did the job. In Ireland, oats had been life on a spoon. They fed farmers and children alike. Boston held the same story, just colder, louder, and more cramped. Molasses or cream, if found, added sweetness. Most days, though, it was bland and basic. Yet in tenement kitchens, it wasn't about taste. It was about strength. Hot oats meant another day at the docks was possible, or another morning in the mills wouldn't leave someone faint. It was breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner. A slow, steady rhythm in a life that offered little predictability. Boiled oats were fuel, and sometimes that was enough. 14. Brown bread with lard or butter, dark, dense, and honest. Brown bread was the backbone of the Irish table in Boston. Made with coarse grains, rye or cornmeal, it stuck to your ribs and stayed there. Baked in iron pots, or steamed until heavy and moist, it filled the space where richer meals might have been. Lard gave it substance. Butter gave it a soul. And even when dry, it never went to waste, soaked in soups or crumbled into stews. In Ireland, this bread had been the taste of peasant kitchens for centuries. Boston immigrant bakers adapted it, using cornmeal when wheat was rare, molasses when sweetness was needed. It wasn't soft. It wasn't delicate, but it was strong, like the people who baked it. What began as bread born from struggle now lines bakery shelves during St. Patrick's Day. But behind every loaf is a story of hunger, hearth, and heritage too strong to fade. 15. Fish chowder. Nothing brought the Irish closer to Boston's harbor than fish chowder, hearty, fragrant, and endlessly flexible. Chopped chunks of cod or haddock met potatoes and onions in a broth that sometimes held milk, sometimes didn't. Whatever was cheap and could stretch got a place in the pot. This wasn't luxury. It was location meeting legacy. Ireland had its own coastal soups. Boston just gave new ingredients. With fish abundant, chowder became adaptation in real time. It warmed homes. It filled pots that rarely emptied. Neighbors stopped by just to grab a bowl. The salt of the sea clung to every spoonful. And each bite felt like the line that tied old world to new. What started as a meal from necessity grew into something proud, a food that didn't hide its beginning, but used it as strength. Fish chowder became Boston's bowl of memory. Served steaming and shared. 16. Corned beef hash. When nothing could be wasted, corned beef hash became more than leftovers. It became tradition. After a hearty boiled dinner, families chopped the scraps, thin ribbons of salty beef, soft chunks of potato, and whatever vegetables remained. Into the pan they went, crisping and caramelizing into a breakfast that felt like luxury. This wasn't about presentation. It was about scraping the pan clean and feeding another meal to a house of hungry mouths. Hash was resilience fried golden, spitting bacon grease or lard, and served hot before dawn. In tenements where quiet was rare, the smell of sizzling onions and fat gave comfort. Children stirred awake to the smells of home, proof another meal had somehow appeared. From scraps to staple, corned beef hash grew from survival's edge into Boston brunch culture. Every bite carries echoes of a people who refused to waste even a crumb of their hard-earned meal. 17. Meat and vegetable hash or stew, the Irish cooked with what they had, and many days what they had was scraps. That's why meat and vegetable hash became a cornerstone. Whatever could be salvaged went into the pot, bones with bits of meat, wilted greens, ends of carrots or cabbage, potato peelings, all boiled until they softened into something warm and sustaining. This wasn't fine dining. It was practicality with a pinch of hope. Butchers sometimes sold bits too tough for richer customers. Immigrants snapped them up, not because they were good, but because they were enough. Flavor came from time. Hours of boiling, stirring, and stretching gave a richness money never could. This hash wasn't just stew, it was a statement. That tenacity could turn scraps to sustenance. That families could stay fed somehow. Each pot was an act of faith. That even in the leanest kitchens, something nourishing could still be born. 18. Potato pancake or griddle cakes. Leftover potatoes never went to waste in Irish homes. They became pancakes, crispy on the edges, tender inside and hot off the griddle. Known back in Ireland as boxty, these cakes were made by mixing leftover mashed potatoes with flour and maybe an egg. On lucky days, the mixture hit a hot pan sizzling, frying in lard or bacon grease until golden. In Boston's cramped kitchens, this was breakfast, dinner, or both. It was fast, affordable, and made a meal from what others might toss aside. Kids loved them, crispy like a treat, simple as it was. Adults saw them for what they were, resourcefulness clothed in comfort, even in hardship. Flavor wasn't completely lost. These pancakes, flipped with care and served warm, reminded families that old recipes could still thrive in a new world. Sometimes, tradition comes back to life not in feasts, but in small, golden cakes hot from the pan. 19. Turnip and cabbage stew with salt pork bits. When budgets shrunk, as they nearly always did, Irish families leaned hard on dishes like turnip and cabbage stew. With only a few fatty scraps of salt pork, they could turn otherwise plain vegetables into something hearty. Salt pork trimmings, often just fat and rind, were boiled to release their smoky richness. Into this went thick wedges of turnips and cabbage, absorbing every bit of flavor. In Ireland, turnips and cabbage were humble crops. In Boston, they remained essentials, cheap, filling, and easy to find at city markets. This wasn't a dish for celebration. It was nourishment, quietly powerful and humble. Families huddled around steaming bowls, each spoonful affirming that hunger wouldn't win today. The pork was minimal, but the message was huge. Even scraps could build something sustaining. That stew wasn't a disappointment. It was resourcefulness and heritage. Bubbling on the stove in a city far from the fields their ancestors once walked. 20. Stewed carrots and parsnips with onions. When meat vanished from the week entirely, which happened often, Boston's Irish families turned toward carrots, onions, and parsnips. 3 simple vegetables, simmered slowly in a pot, made a stew that was naturally sweet and soft enough for children to chew without complaint. This was food that asked for patience. Hours of low heat coaxed flavor from even the plainest roots. In Ireland, root vegetables had always been the fallback. Reliable, cheap, honest. They required nothing fancy, just time and water. On streets where coin was scarce and work was grueling, this kind of stew became reassurance in a bowl. No plates overflowed, no seconds waited, but everyone ate, and that was enough. It didn't take much to feel full, but it took heart to keep stretching. Pot after pot, week after week, this stew proved you could still feed a family, even when the butcher and baker were beyond your reach. 21. Boiled root vegetables with meat broth. Sometimes, meat existed only in trace form, disappearing into the broth after a long boil. But for Boston's Irish families, even the broth left behind was worth gold. They reused it to prepare simple meals of boiled carrots, turnips, rutabagas, the kinds of vegetables that filled carts in city markets and lasted through bitter winters. The broth gave life to what would otherwise be plain. Root vegetables softened, soaked in flavor, and filled plates beside slices of soda bread. Children didn't need meat to recognize warmth in a bowl. Neither did their parents. This dish taught hard lessons gently, that survival wasn't about having plenty, but about using wisely. The broth may have held memories instead of meat. Still, it warmed fingers and bellies, proving that effort could turn absence into nourishment. It wasn't just what you ate, it was how you made it matter. 22. Grits or cornmeal. Mush. Cornmeal didn't trace back to Irish fields, but it found a place in Irish kitchens soon after families arrived in Boston. Taught by neighbors and learned on the fly, cornmeal mush or grits became a staple. Boiled into a thick porridge with water, and occasionally milk, it filled pots and people alike. On lean days, it was the only thing steaming by morning. Sweetened with molasses if available, or sprinkled with salt when nothing else could be spared. Cornmeal was cheap, forgiving, and sold in bulk. Some families came to prefer it over oats simply because it lasted longer. Mothers stirred big pots of it before dawn, watching their children eat not with excitement but relief. It wasn't Irish, but it became theirs. In the end, cornmeal mush was more than just food. It was proof they could adapt without losing who they were. Endurance served by the spoon. 23. Fruit compote with bread or oat cakes. Sweetness was a rarity, and when it came, it felt like a celebration. A pot of fruit compote, made from stewed apples, dried currants, or borrowed berries, transformed even the bleakest week. Served over slices of soda bread or oat cakes, it felt extravagant, even if sugar was scarce. In Ireland, this was a method of preservation. In Boston, it became a treat, a pause in a diet of roots and grains. Parents saved peels, bruised fruit, whatever could stew. And what simmered wasn't just dessert, it was a spiritual tonic. Children's eyes lit up when fruit appeared on the table. It meant more than sweetness. It meant someone still hoped for joy. In tenement kitchens, where meat was rare and silence rarer, a spoonful of compote offered a kind of peace. That soft, tart, sweet flavor wasn't survival. It was celebration, served quiet but felt deeply. 24. Toasted bread pudding. No food went unloved, not even stale bread. Irish families turned hardened loaves into something soft, warm and astonishing. Bread pudding, torn into pieces, soaked in milk and sweetened with molasses or sugar if available. The bread was baked until golden, then devoured. In Ireland, this kind of frugality was second nature. In Boston, it felt like reclaiming power, turning waste into warmth. Children adored it. Soft, sweet, and different from the daily fare of boiled roots and oats. For mothers, bread pudding was quiet victory. A moment they could give their families something that felt special, even when pennies were few and weeks wore thin. This wasn't just a dessert. It was morale. Solace, baked firm, then spooned gently into bowls and laps. Every bite was proof. Joy could still rise from crumbs. All it took was care, creativity, and the timeless instinct to provide. 25. Bean soup with root vegetables. Bean soup was the final defense against hunger. In Irish Boston, dried beans or peas, bought cheap and kept in sacks, were transformed into meals that could last for days. With potatoes, carrots, onions, or parsnips cooked alongside, the beans softened into thick, hearty broths that got better with each reheating. Meat wasn't missed when the pot was deep and the spoon generous. In Ireland, pulses were fallback crops. In Boston, they grew into lifelines, reliable, affordable, and filling. Soda bread helped soak the broth. Nothing got left behind. For children, the monotony didn't matter. They were warm. They were fed. That alone made this soup a kind of sustenance heavier than calories. This was community food. Soup shared with neighbors, thinned for guests, and remembered long after things got better. Not just nourishment, but a testament that shared struggle, when simmered long enough, creates something unbreakable. New England boiled dinner. One pot, one hope. That's what New England boiled dinner represented. Picture a small stove tucked into a South Boston tenement, steam rising as corned beef gently simmers, cabbage softens on top, and hearty root vegetables fill the spaces between. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot, heavy, and enough. Back in Ireland, beef had been luxury, rare and beyond reach. But in Boston, salted beef was affordable and sold in bulk. Add in the ever-present potatoes and cabbage, and a new staple was born, filling, frugal, and familiar. Boiling everything in one pot made fuel-efficient sense, and leftovers often became hash the next morning. The dish evolved, but its roots stayed deep. What began as immigrant thrift became local tradition. Today, corned beef and cabbage fill plates on St. Patrick's Day, not just for celebration, but as a tribute, a reminder of those who came with little and left lasting flavor. This dish? It's a symbol of survival disguised as a holiday meal. The story of Irish food in Boston isn't just measured in ingredients. It's made from memory, perseverance, and adaptation. Behind every ladle of soup, slice of bread or bubbling pot of stew is a mother stretching her pantry further than it should go. A father finding comfort after back-breaking labor. A child learning taste while understanding hunger. These meals weren't put together in celebration, but in survival. Over time, pieces of each dish embedded themselves into Boston's culinary DNA. Today's corned beef, soda bread, chowder bowls, they all grew from seeds planted in struggle and nurtured by culture. What began with famine and immigration quietly, shaped an entire city's plate. Because food isn't just what fills you, it tells your story. And in Boston, the Irish story still simmers quietly beneath tradition and taste, reminding all who gather. The past never left the table. It found a way to be passed down.